Fire Emblem Engage's final expansion pass content just dropped, and it's the meatiest wave of the lot, the Fell Xenologue. The new story is locked early on in the campaign, but it's left ambiguous as to when exactly it takes place canonically, though it's definitely pre-Chapter 20, I'd say. While there are no explicit spoilers for the late game, it does hint at some later plot points, so if you want to play Fell Xenologue during your first playthrough of Engage, I'd advise holding off, at least for a few chapters. Or actually, maybe just wait until the late game, because Fell Xenologue is hard, even by Engage standards, which is probably why it has a separate difficulty setting that can be changed up or down at will, unlike the main game which only lets you make the game easier after you set it for the first time. Fell Xenologue is also locked to casual mode. Other than Lear or the Dragon Twins, anyone else who dies will come back good as new in the next map. This is a huge plus, as I think I would have gone insane trying to complete this and keep everyone alive. So, what is Fell Xenologue? Lear is summoned to an alternate Helios by the aforementioned Dragon Twins, Nell and Nil, to help them fix their world. The premise is similar to Awakening's future past story, with both taking place in an alternate, much bleaker timeline. Here, Lear is asked to help collect this world's emblems, the 7 bracelets, from the 4 countries and a new enemy implied to have inherited Sombron's will. You meet this world's royals along the way, and I really like how they were handled. From the trailers you'd think that they're all mirror versions of ours, but that's not always the case. To cite some early examples, Alchrist is absolutely the polar opposite of Ken Alchrist, but Alfred is pretty much the same, and especially if you've seen their supports, Saline and Diamant are familiar enough that you can see how our versions of them could have turned out the same way had they been in these new situations. So basically it's a mix of reimaginings, and I appreciate that creativity. All their class and personal skills also get renamed to match these new takes on them, and even Helios itself is mirrored, which was a neat touch. The story as a whole is quite nice too, and Nell in particular is a very interesting new lead as she tries to fix a world that's almost post-apocalyptic with how much has gone wrong. She has a very compelling dynamic with Alear too, with the 2 butting heads more often than not, so people who hate Avatar worship might like her as well. On the other hand, despite the overall bleakness of the story, I think it still ends up pulling some punches that weaken it overall, and I would have quite liked to see a version of Fell Xenologue that doubled down on those vibes instead. As for the gameplay, I'll say right away that these maps aren't as varied as Cindered Shadows maps from 3 Houses. There, each map apart from the first had some unique gimmick that mixed things up, but here the diversity in the early maps come from introducing new enemy types, new monster types, and the 2 DLC classes which are used much more freely than the Divine Paralogs. And it's only after these are established that the breaks truly come off, and those later maps do some really creative things, particularly the final map, which does something brand new for Fire Emblem and really made you balance the risks and rewards of each turn. On the other hand, another thing introduced to Fire Emblem here is Nil. Right away the game warns you that Nil can't fight well and will score a game over if he dies, so he's an escort mission. Fire Emblem gave us an escort mission. It's fine enough early on since you can create safe spaces for him, but when reinforcements show up, especially in the later, much wider maps, he becomes a liability. My advice is to get Tiki's bracelet before starting the DLC and put a divine blessing on him ASAP. Nell and the other newcomers are pretty weak too, but they can at least take a hit before dying. Another issue I have, and one that honestly feels like an oversight, is that because the newcomers are treated as guest characters, you can't change their inventories. You can equip emblems onto them, but if you wanted to, for example, give Nell a spear for ranged attacks, you'd have to equip it to one of your other units and then trade it to her once the battle starts. It's just a weird decision I don't understand. But swinging back around to a surprising positive, everyone in Fell Xenologue has fixed stats. Now that may sound tedious, but I think it's an effective way of ensuring all players are on an even playing field here, regardless of when they start the new campaign, and since all the units you currently have are scaled to each map, you try out units you may not have otherwise. It's unfortunate that classes are also locked though. While it's cool to have a canon advanced class for the early recruits, if you, like me, are used to some units being reclassed, this decision may make it difficult to use them here. Every unit gets an inventory based on their current class, so I wish we could have had a situation like Cindered Shadows where everyone had 1 or 2 options to choose from. But if you're thinking that having fixed classes and stats would make things more difficult, you're correct. But thankfully bond levels for emblems and inherited skills are still intact, so you can fall back on those. Again, much like the enforced casual mode. Upon completing the story, you unlock a bunch of new faces to use in the main story, along with items for the 2 new classes, Enchanter, a support class, and Mage Cannoneer, who's a hybrid between support and offense. As mentioned before, both are pretty unique as Fire Emblem goes, but the promotion items for both are pretty expensive, so be careful who you give them to. Maybe wait for some Fae YouTubers to test them out first. Overall, I enjoyed Fell Xenologue and the expansion pass as a whole. I think it's a bit overpriced, and dropping the price by a few bucks would have made it perfect, but if you don't mind the investment, or find a retailer selling it at a discount, and you already enjoy Engage, well, there are far worse things to spend your time on. Thanks for reaching the end of this review, and please let me know what you thought of Fell Xenologue if you have it, and also any feedback on this review too if you have that. I'd love to get better at this stuff. Thank you all again again, please consider the usual call to action stuff if you want to support the channel. And as always, have a great day.